United States, spring 2018. It was an ordinary afternoon, a day that wouldn't appear in any newspaper until decisions made inside a public building changed the fate of several people forever. That day, a U.S. Army captain walked into a police station just to pick up her mother. Minutes later, a corrupt inspector crossed all boundaries. He used the law as a weapon, arrested an innocent woman, and believed his power was absolute. What he didn't know was that family was keeping a secret capable of turning the system against him. In this video, you will follow a fact-based account, reconstructed step by step, that shows how abuse of authority can seem invisible until it affects the wrong person. What happened next wasn't quick, it wasn't pretty, and it wasn't announced in headlines, but it was real. Welcome to this video about untold stories. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment below telling us where you're listening from and the exact time. This helps the channel a lot. Leave a like now, because this story proves that the most powerful uniform isn't always what it seems, and because the ending will make you understand why. United States, spring 2018. The official report would record everything in just 3 cold lines, hastily typed on an old computer at the county sheriff's office. But those who were there know that day couldn't be contained in 3 lines. It couldn't even fit on a whole page. It was shortly after 4:40 p.m., the time when the city begins to slow down. Traffic thinned, shops closed their metal doors, and the sun cast long shadows on the hot asphalt. It was at this moment that Captain Hannah Miller, an active duty officer in the United States Army, entered the parking lot of the county administrative building to pick up her mother. The mother, Margaret Miller, 62, a retired teacher, had been called in to clarify a bureaucratic misunderstanding related to an old family property. Nothing serious, according to the phone call. Nothing to worry about. Hannah was in uniform, not because she was forced to, but out of habit. It came straight from the military base, where she had served for over 12 years with 2 overseas tours and an impeccable disciplinary record. For her, the uniform had always been more than just fabric. It was a symbol of order, rules, and boundaries. She didn't know that, in that building, the rules had already been bent and the boundaries erased. As Hannah entered the lobby, she sensed something was wrong. There wasn't the usual flurry of activity among employees at the end of the workday. 2 police officers were talking quietly near the door, stopping as soon as they saw her. One of them looked away. The other pretended to check his cell phone. At the end of the hallway, a male voice echoed, too loud for a public setting. "You will answer when I ask." Hannah recognized the voice even before she saw the face. It was Chief Inspector Richard Coleman. Coleman was not an unknown name in the city. On the contrary, he had been in the position for almost 20 years, known for solving problems quickly. For some, efficiency. For others, fear. Hannah quickened her pace. The room was open. Inside, her mother sat, her hands trembling on her purse, her eyes brimming with tears. Across from her, Coleman stood, leaning over the table, his finger pointed as if he were interrogating a dangerous criminal, not a retired teacher. "What's going on here?" Hannah asked firmly, stepping through the doorway. Coleman turned slowly. His gaze swept over her uniform from head to toe. For a second, it seemed as if he were measuring his strength. "This doesn't concern you, Captain," he replied with a half smile. "We're conducting a police investigation." Hannah maintained her composure. "That woman is my mother, and as far as I know, she was called in for questioning, not to be intimidated." The air grew heavy, a short but dense silence. Coleman took another step closer. "I'll repeat it," he said, now in a low, harsh voice. "This isn't a military matter. Get that uniform out of my sight." That's when Hannah did something simple, something nice, something any manual recommends. "If there are any formal charges, my mother has the right to a lawyer. Until then, she will not answer any more questions." What happened next wasn't mentioned in any training reminder. Coleman exploded. "Do you think you can come here and order me around?" he shouted. "You don't have any authority outside your barracks." He took one step further than he should have. Hannah didn't back down, and then it happened. With a sudden movement, Coleman shoved Hannah with his forearm, striking her in the shoulder and chest. The impact didn't knock her down, but it was enough to leave her breathless for a second. The silence turned to shock. Margaret stood up suddenly. "Don't touch my daughter." That was the fatal mistake. Coleman turned to the mother and without warning ordered her arrest right there. "She's obstructing an investigation. Handcuff her." "That's absurd," Hannah reacted. "You have no legal basis." 2 policemen rushed in. Neither looked Hannah in the eye. The handcuffs snapped shut on Margaret's wrists. She began to cry, demanding explanations that no one would give. Hannah tried to approach and was stopped. "One more step and I'll have you dragged out of here by force," Coleman said, "and I don't care about your rank." The U.S. Army captain stood motionless, not out of fear, but because she understood something in that instant. That man wasn't just abusing his power, he felt untouchable. As her mother was led down the hallway, Hannah remained there, feeling the weight of something she had never experienced, not even in war zones: powerlessness within her own country. Before leaving the room, Coleman approached her one last time and said, almost in a whisper, "This will teach you not to meddle where you're not wanted." Hannah did not respond. But at that moment, on the other side of town, someone was starting to observe records, schedules, and names. Someone who hadn't been mentioned before. Someone Coleman would never have imagined involving. And that's when he made his first mistake, unaware that it would also be the beginning of the end. That same night, at 10:13 p.m., Margaret Miller's name was already listed in the system as arrested for obstruction of justice and disorderly conduct. Neither of those words reflected reality. Hannah discovered this sitting alone on the hard bench in the hallway of the county police station. The building, which hours before had seemed like just an ordinary administrative center, now resembled a hostile labyrinth. Closed doors, tinted windows, people passing by without answering questions. She could still feel the mark of the shove on her body. It wasn't physical pain, it was something deeper. In 12 years of military service, Hannah had been trained to withstand pressure, remain calm under enemy fire, and trust the chain of command. But there was no chain here. There was a wall. When she was finally allowed to speak to an officer on duty, she heard the first official version of events. "Your mother got upset," said the sergeant, without looking up from the monitor. The inspector tried to calm the situation. "That's a lie," Hannah replied. "There are cameras in that room." The sergeant hesitated for half a second, just enough to confirm what she suspected. The cameras in that area were undergoing maintenance today. The phrase was uttered with excessive nonchalance. Maintenance occurred at the exact moment of the incident. Hannah took a deep breath. "I want to speak with a lawyer." "You can," he replied, "but your mother will only be presented to the judge tomorrow. She poses no risk whatsoever. She is elderly and has heart disease. It's already been decided." That was the word that kept being repeated that night. Decided. As if everything had already been written before it even happened. Around midnight, Hannah tried one last direct approach. She asked to speak to Coleman again. She was informed that he had already finished his shift. The inspector, who hours earlier had been shouting and pushing, had now simply disappeared. Hannah left the police station with the feeling that something much bigger was at play, something that couldn't be explained simply by a fit of rage. The following morning, she returned accompanied by a civil lawyer recommended by a colleague from the base, an experienced man, accustomed to dealing with abuses of authority in small towns. The lawyer requested access to the case files. He received incomplete pages. "This is full of holes," he muttered. "Inconsistent schedules, missing signatures, generic witnesses." "What does that mean?" Hannah asked. He looked around before answering. "It means that someone is protecting someone else." The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 2 days later, enough time for rumors to start circulating. In the city, distorted versions quickly emerged. The captain's mother freaked out. She tried to interfere in a serious investigation. The inspector was just doing his job. Hannah realized her reputation was being quietly undermined. People who used to greet her now looked away. A civilian colleague warned her in a low voice, "They're saying you lost control, that you almost assaulted a police officer." She felt a chill run down her spine. The narrative was being rewritten. On the second day, when she finally managed to see her mother for a few minutes, Margaret seemed smaller, more fragile. There were red marks on her wrists where the handcuffs had been for too long. "They made me sign a paper," Margaret said weakly. "They said it was just to confirm my information." The lawyer's expression hardened. "What role?" "I don't know. I was nervous." Hannah closed her eyes for a moment. Confessions obtained under pressure, a classic. "Mom, listen," she said, holding her hand. "You didn't do anything wrong. I promise I'll fix this." Margaret tried to smile. "I know. But be careful, daughter. That man doesn't seem like someone who loses." That same afternoon, Hannah received an unexpected call from base command. "Captain Miller, we need you to come in for some administrative clarification." "Clarifications about what?" "Regarding a formal complaint filed against you for inappropriate conduct off duty." The ground seemed to give way beneath his feet. "Who filed the complaint?" There was a pause. "By Inspector Richard Coleman." Now it was clear. It wasn't just just about the mother. It was direct retaliation. That night, Hannah sat alone in the kitchen, surrounded by papers, notes, and incomplete copies of the file. The silence was broken only by the ticking of the clock. She opened her phone and scrolled through her contact list. She stopped at a name, one she hadn't spoken to in months, a name that rarely came up in family conversations. She hesitated. On the other side of town, in an unassuming building, someone was analyzing internal reports, cross-referencing data from police stations, old complaints, and recurring patterns. The name Richard Coleman appeared more often than it should have. Hannah took a deep breath and made the connection. On the other end of the line, a female voice answered, calm, firm, professional. Police station, you can speak. Hannah swallowed hard before replying, I'm Hannah Miller. I think you need to know what's happening with our mother. There was a brief silence, then just one sentence. Don't hang up, and don't say anything else on the phone. At that moment, the inspector still believed he was in control. He didn't know the game had just changed. The preliminary hearing took place in a small room without an audience at 9:02 a.m. No press, no curious onlookers. Just a tired judge, a hurried prosecutor, and a process that seemed to have been hastily assembled, but with a clear objective. Keep Margaret Miller imprisoned. The prosecutor read the charges in an automatic, almost bored tone. Obstruction of justice, contempt of authority, and hostile behavior in a public building. The defense attorney asked for the floor. Your Honor, my client is a retired teacher with no criminal record and documented health problems. There is no legal justification for keeping her detained. The judge leafed through the papers slowly. He stopped. He frowned. Where is the full incident report? The prosecutor cleared his throat. The report from the responsible inspector has already been attached. Only his? Asked the judge. Silence. No camera footage. No independent statement. No medical record of the shove Hannah suffered. Still, the judge sighed and said, detention maintained pending further evaluation. Full hearing in 7 days. The hammer struck. 7 days. For Margaret, it sounded like a death sentence. For Hannah, it was confirmation of something far worse. The system had chosen a side. As she left the room, she felt eyes on her. Not eyes of curiosity, of warning. 2 men in plain clothes were watching from a distance, talking quietly. When Hannah looked at them, they dispersed. That same day, the lawyer received an anonymous call. They're trying to force a deal, he said seriously. They want your mother to sign a partial confession. In exchange, they'd release her. Never, Hannah replied. That's a lie. I know, but that's how they close problematic cases. In the afternoon, Hannah was officially called to command the base. The meeting lasted less than 15 minutes. We are not judging the merits of the case, the superior said, but there is a civil investigation underway. Until that is clarified, we recommend discretion. Discretion. The word sounded almost offensive. I was assaulted by a public official, Hannah said. My mother is being held illegally. Still, Captain, we need to avoid institutional friction. At that moment, Hannah understood she was alone, officially, but not completely. Meanwhile, in another building far away, someone was doing something Coleman could never have imagined. The woman who had answered the phone that night, Hannah's sister, did not react with emotion. She reacted methodically. She opened an old file, then another and another. Complaints forgotten, cases closed without explanation, suspicious transfers of agents who dared to report irregularities. Richard Coleman's name appeared repeatedly, always in the center, always untouched. She requested internal data under administrative justification. No one questioned it. When someone holds the right position, doors open without a sound. In less than 48 hours, a pattern became clear. Arrests without cameras, disappearing testimonies, elderly and vulnerable people used as easy targets. Margaret was no exception. She was just the latest. In the county jail, Margaret began experiencing chest pains. She requested medical attention. She was ignored for hours. One officer commented in a low voice, orders from above. That night, Hannah received a short call from the lawyer. We have a bigger problem, he said. The inspector has filed a request to extend your mother's detention due to risk of external interference. Hannah gripped the phone tightly. Interference from whom? From you. It was at that moment that she realized the complete strategy. To imprison the mother, silence the daughter, and force them both to the point of maximum exhaustion. The inspector didn't want justice. He wanted submission. But what he didn't know, and nobody there knew, was that every altered document, every verbal order, and every threat was being silently recorded, not on ordinary paper, but in reports that didn't disappear. That morning, Hannah's sister closed her her laptop and made a single call. "Prepare a discreet team," she said. "No fanfare, no local contact." On the other end of the line, the answer came short. "Understood." When? She looked at the name on the screen. Richard Coleman. Now. In that same city, the inspector slept peacefully, certain that he had won. He didn't know yet that he had just arrested the wrong person. Until that moment, for almost everyone in the city, Emily Carter was just another name in administrative records. Discreet, technical, little known outside her professional circle. What nobody there knew, and Inspector Richard Coleman even less so, was that Emily didn't work for the local police. She worked above them. Emily Carter was a state marshal, assigned 5 years earlier to a unit specializing in institutional corruption and abuse of power. Her work rarely appeared in the newspapers. When it did, the names had already been dropped. The morning after the hearing, Emily arrived in town without a visible escort. She was wearing ordinary clothes, driving a rental car, and carrying only a thin briefcase. She didn't go to the police station. She didn't look for the judge. She didn't speak to anyone. First, he observed, she passed by the county building twice, at different times. She noted entries, exits, and shift changes. She saw Coleman arrive shortly after 8, confident, talking to 2 subordinates who were laughing at something he was saying. Emily didn't feel anger. She felt confirmation. That same afternoon, she met Hannah at a neutral location, a simple diner on the outskirts of town. There were no long hugs. There was no excessive emotion. "You shouldn't be here," Hannah said softly. "I should," Emily replied, "and you did the right thing by calling me." Emily heard everything: the shove, the arrest, the cameras under maintenance, the fabricated accusations. He didn't interrupt. He just took notes. "They still don't know who I am," Emily said, closing her notebook, "and it's better that way." "What can you do?" Hannah asked. Emily looked directly at her sister. "What the law allows, when someone thinks they are above it." The next day, formal requests began to surface in the internal systems. Discreet, technical, impossible to ignore. Routine audits, administrative reviews, requests for copies of old reports signed by Coleman. None of this mentioned Margaret Miller. None of this cited Hannah. This was how it was done when the target couldn't perceive the encirclement. Coleman received the first warning that morning. "Inspector, we've received a request from the state asking for old files," an assistant informed them. "About what?" he asked, irritated. "They didn't specify. They say it's standard maintenance." Coleman frowned but showed no concern. "Send whatever they ask for." That was the mistake, because by sending those files, he delivered patterns, and patterns tell stories that people can't erase. Emily cross-referenced dates, names, signatures, arrests always without recordings, elderly people always involved, witnesses always absent, and curiously, complaints always filed at the same stage. In the county jail, Margaret's situation began to subtly change. A nurse appeared unannounced. A doctor examined her heart. Handcuffs were no longer used during internal transfers. No explanation was given. Coleman realized. "Who authorized this?" he asked a prison guard. "Administrative order," the man replied. "It came from above." "From whose height?" The jailer shrugged. For the first time in years, Coleman felt something he didn't feel often: uncertainty. That night he tried to make a call. He wanted to make sure everything was under control. The call went unanswered. Meanwhile, Emily was finalizing a preliminary report, not an indictment report, a contextual report, the kind of document that precedes major downfalls. She signed with her full name and position, and for the first time, he authorized that the name Richard Coleman be formally linked to a state investigation. Nothing was announced, nothing leaked, but from that moment on, Coleman was no longer just an inspector. He was under investigation, and he still had no idea who had pulled the cord. Richard Coleman realized something was wrong the morning no one responded to his orders in a hurry. It was a small detail, almost imperceptible to those unfamiliar with the environment. But Coleman knew. For years, a single glance was enough to get subordinates moving. That morning, however, the responses came slowly, cautiously, excessively formally. "Do it today," he told an investigator. "Of course, Inspector," the man replied. "I'll register the request first." Register. Before, nobody registered. Coleman went back to his office and slammed the door shut. He opened the internal system and tried to access some old files. 2 of them were marked as under review, state review. His stomach clenched. He knew what that meant, not officially, but in practice. When the state began reviewing local records, it wasn't by chance. It was because someone from outside had asked for it. Coleman tried to mentally reconstruct the last few days. The captain, the mother, the lawyer, and then the call Hannah Miller had made that that night. No, he murmured to himself. But instead of retreating, Coleman did what he always did when he felt threatened. He advanced. That afternoon, he called one of the youngest officers on the team. "I need you to add a supplement to Ms. Miller's arrest report," he said, handing her a piece of paper with handwritten notes. "Additional information. Now." The young man read quickly. He hesitated. "Sir, this changes the schedule and involves a level of physical exertion that wasn't previously considered." Coleman approached. "Are you questioning an order?" "No, sir. Just then do it." The police officer nodded, but something had changed. He didn't seem convinced. He seemed cautious. Coleman didn't notice or ignored it. That same night, an anonymous phone call reached Hannah's lawyer. "They're altering documents," the voice said. "Don't trust anything new that comes your way." It was the warning that confirmed everything. The next day, Emily received the supplementary report. She read it line by line and smiled without humor. "Here it is," she said softly. "Subsequent alteration of an official document. A crime that's easy to prove, difficult to justify." She attached the report to the dossier and did something Coleman would never have imagined. She requested the metadata, schedules, user, terminal used. Everything pointed to the same room, to the same computer, to the same name. Meanwhile, Coleman tried one last gambit. He filed an emergency request to transfer Margaret Miller to another unit outside the county, citing risk to institutional security. The request went up and came back denied in less than an hour. Without explanation, it was at that moment that he knew he was no longer in control. In prison, Margaret was informed that she would be released under temporary medical custody. It wasn't full freedom, but it was a drastic change. Hannah accompanied her to the exit. She hugged her mother carefully, as if she might break. "It will end," Hannah said. "I promise." Margaret simply nodded. On the other side of town, Emily was signing the final authorization for the next phase. There would be no arrests yet. There would be no headlines. First would come the internal exposure, then the collapse. Coleman spent the night awake. He reread old reports. He deleted messages. He tried calling contacts who used to answer on the first ring. No one answered. The following morning, upon arriving at the police station, he found a brown envelope on the table. No return address. No prior notice. Inside, there was only one sheet of paper. "Preserve all documents and communications. Further destruction or alteration will be considered obstruction of a state investigation." Coleman sat down slowly. For the first time in 20 years, the inspector had nowhere to run. And yet, he didn't know the most important part. The investigation that was closing in on him hadn't started with Margaret, nor with Hannah. She had started years before, and now everything was about to come to light. The notification arrived at 8:17 a.m., printed on State Department of Justice letterhead. It wasn't an invitation, it was an order. Richard Coleman read the document 3 times, trying to find some loophole, some formal error that he could use as a shield. He found none. Mandatory attendance for immediate administrative clarifications. His heart beat faster when he reached the signature at the bottom. Emily Carter, state delegate. The name wasn't unfamiliar to him, but the surname, now it made sense. Coleman felt a weight descend through his entire body, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. He understood in that instant what had happened. The captain, the mother, the connection that night. Everything fell into place too late. When he left the room, 2 agents he didn't know were waiting in the hallway. They weren't wearing local uniforms. They weren't smiling. They weren't explaining anything. "Inspector Coleman," one of them said, "from this moment on, you are removed from your operational duties." "This is an abuse," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I demand to speak to my lawyer." "You'll have that opportunity," the agent replied. In due time, in the meeting room, Emily waited seated, with an open folder in front of her. She did not stand up when he entered. "Inspector," she said in a neutral voice, "thank you for coming." Coleman stared at her for a few seconds. There was no anger on her face, nor satisfaction, just the control. "So, it's you," he murmured. "It's me," Emily replied, "and I'm here in the legal performance of my duties." She slid the folder across the table. "We have records of at least 16 incidents, with patterns similar to the case of Mrs. Margaret Miller. Alteration of reports, absence of recordings, coercion of witnesses." Coleman tried to interrupt. "This is a personal attack." Emily calmly raised her hand. "No, it's an institutional investigation. Your relationship with the victims is irrelevant to the facts." She turned a page. "Here is the supplementary report that you requested be filed after the start of the state review. With complete metadata." The silence grew heavy. heavy. "You know what that means," she continued. "Deliberate obstruction." Coleman was breathing heavily now. He tried to lean back in his chair. "I always acted to maintain order," he said, almost in automatic defense. "No," Emily replied without raising her voice. "You acted to maintain control." She closed the folder. "The difference is important." That same day, Margaret Miller had all charges dropped. No public apology was made. No press conference was scheduled. In real-world cases, corrections rarely come under the spotlight. Hannah received the call while she was by her mother's side at the hospital, accompanying her to tests. "Is it over?" she asked. "It's almost over," Emily replied, "but it's not finished yet." Coleman left the police station under escort, not handcuffed, not yet. Some people watched from the windows, others pretended not to see. That late afternoon, his name was removed from the internal system. The following morning, the doorplate was taken off. No announcement, no ceremony, but there was something Coleman couldn't erase. The records, the dates, the names. That night, alone at home, he turned on the television and saw a short note on the state news. State Department confirms ongoing investigation into high-ranking officials' conduct at a police station in the interior. No names were mentioned, but he knew. And for the first time, Richard Coleman understood what his victims had felt for years. The fear of having no control whatsoever over what would come next. No sirens announced the end of Richard Coleman's life. No press conference explained the details. No local authority offered a formal apology. The process followed the most common path in real-life cases: silent, technical, and inevitable. 3 weeks after his removal, Coleman was formally indicted for obstruction of justice, falsification of official documents, and abuse of authority. The charges did not come all at once. They came in blocks as old cases were reopened. Each new file confirmed the pattern. Arrests without recording. Reports adjusted after the fact. Victims chosen because they seemed too fragile to react. Margaret Miller became just one name among many, but she was the name that connected all the others. The lawyer explained something important to Hannah. If that weren't the case, perhaps it would have continued for a few more years. Not because it was invisible, but because no one had forced the system to look. Margaret was recovering slowly. Her body was weak, but her mind was intact. In an official statement, she said only one sentence: "I just wanted to go home that day." That was enough. Emily remained on the case until the end of the administrative phase. She never spoke to the press. She never answered personal questions. In her final report, she wrote only the essentials. It's not about an individual, but about a structure that allowed for repetition. Coleman lost his job even before the criminal trial. His retirement was revoked. Benefits were suspended. Friends disappeared. Contacts went silent. At the final hearing, there was no speech, only the reading of the charges and dates. He didn't look at Hannah. He didn't look at Margaret. He didn't look at Emily. He left the room the same way he entered the system, without ceremony. Months later, the police station underwent restructuring. Cameras were reinstalled. Procedures were reviewed. An internal memo was issued citing structural flaws. No names mentioned. Life went on. Hannah returned to base. She continued serving. She never publicly requested compensation. She never spoke of revenge. When questioned by colleagues, she would simply reply, "The law worked." Late, but it worked. Emily was transferred to another case, another state, another name on another file. Margaret resumed walking alone through the neighborhood. Sometimes she would stop in front of the old county building, not out of fear, but to remember that silence can also be broken. Richard Coleman awaited trial on conditional release. He gave no interviews, he wrote no letters, he left no alternative versions of events. In official reports, his name now appears as a footnote in a list of reopened cases. This is how it usually ends. No applause, no poetic justice, no cinematic ending. It's simply a matter of realizing that power didn't fall all at once. It was emptied, document by document. And that on that ordinary spring day when a captain entered a public building to retrieve her mother. Someone who considered herself untouchable made the mistake of believing that no one was watching.